You shall not murder. Exodus 20:13. Hello, welcome to Geekdom of God. I'm your host, Siantir, and today I'm going to talk about the Sixth Commandment. The Sixth Commandment itself is a very straightforward prohibition of murder, but it hasn't always been translated that way. In fact, this is how the King James Version renders it. Thou shalt not kill. I don't know why the King James translators made that change. The original Hebrew is decidedly murder and not kill. But I bring it up because it is important to understand the distinction between murder and killing. Murder is the act of unlawfully killing someone. Every time someone is murdered, they have also been killed, but not every time someone is killed have they also been murdered. There are, broadly speaking, 4 categories of killing another human being that the Bible indicates aren't murder. 1. The execution of justice. 2. Soldiers during battle. 3. Legitimate accidents. 4. Self-defense, in limited capacities. Let's go over all 4 of these. The first of these is the execution of justice. This is also often known as capital punishment. It is when whatever the person has done results in the punishment of death. We see 2 general categories of this type of killing in the Bible. The first is specifically a penal type, as laid out in legal documents. Parts of Exodus, much of Leviticus, and parts of Numbers and Deuteronomy contain this sort of thing, but it can also be found in governmental law. Indeed, the Bible tells us that this type of law and punishment is a task given to government by God. Not only is it directly given to the Israelites, such as in Exodus 21:14, but the sentiment is also more generally stated in Romans 13:4. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. This brings us to the second type of killing as an execution of justice, the pouring out of God's wrath, a type of divine reckoning and judgment upon the sinful. This was often done through military action, as well as brutal massacres. It can be hard for us to accept today because the condemnation of an entire culture can seem grossly unfair to us. To an extent, this is in part because of how insulated we are against truly heinous cultural practices. Consider Moses' recounting of the early stages of the Israelites' efforts to possess their land in Deuteronomy 2:31-34. The Lord said to me, "See, I have begun to deliver Sihon and his country over to you. Now begin to conquer and possess his land." When Sihon and all his army came out to meet us in the battle at Jahaz, the Lord our God delivered him over to us, and we struck him down, together with his sons and his whole army. At that time, we took all his towns and completely destroyed them, men, women, and children. We left no survivors. This sort of destruction seems overly cruel to us, but there are a few things we need to consider. The first is that the destruction of the Amorites was long foretold. God gave them time to repent, and their culture continued to produce endless sins. Here are God's words to Abraham, yes, the Abraham, on the Amorites from Genesis 15:16. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. God gave them time to repent. They did not. The next factor we need to consider is that God was, and is, keenly aware of how powerful cultural influences are. This is a lengthy passage, but it is worth paying attention to what God says about the need for this destruction in Exodus 34:10-16. Then the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. Obey what I command you today. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves with their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. God knew that if any of these peoples were to live, that their culture would inevitably infect the Israelites and lead them away from him and into sin. As it turns out, the Israelites failed to fully wipe out these various peoples, and they indeed led them into sin. Sins such as sacrificing their children to their idols. 2 Chronicles 28:3 is very explicit about this. He, King Ahaz, burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben-Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. God despises human sacrifice, and he did not want his people infected with that kind of filth. It is also worth stating that God takes idolatry far more seriously than we tend to take it. We humans chronically fail to understand the severity of our wickedness, and I very much so include myself in that statement. Our measure for innocence is poorly calibrated. There are other incidents throughout the Old Testament where it is clear that things like war, famine, and plague were caused by God's wrath. The exile of the Israelites from their lands makes it very clear that that event occurred for that reason. Additionally, many of the Old Testament books of prophecy predict such acts of judgment. Do these sorts of acts still happen today? I don't think they do. I believe that the coming of Christ changed the paradigm from one of regular execution of divine wrath to delayed judgment. But make no mistake, judgment is coming. But enough of that. It's time to talk about the second type of killing that isn't murder, which is the actual topic of this episode, in case you'd forgotten. The second type of permissible killing is by soldiers during battle. During battle is important here. Something like Joab's assassination of Abner is wrong. For those unfamiliar with it, let me give you a summary of things. The full text would be far too long for this episode, but I do encourage you to verify the summary by reading the accounts in 1st and 2nd Samuel. The first king of Israel was Saul, and his military commander was Abner. Saul was disobedient to God, and so God appointed David, who had no direct relation to Saul, as the next king of Israel. Joab was David's military commander. When Saul died, rather than obey God's appointment of David, Abner attempted to install one of Saul's sons as the next king. This caused a period of civil war between Saul's son and David, which resulted in battles being fought between their two armies. During one of these battles, Abner killed Joab's brother Asahel. This was a battlefield death, and therefore not a murder, but Joab held a grudge. Later on, Saul's son accused Abner of having sex with one of Saul's concubines. This angered Abner, so he determined to give the kingdom to David, rather than continue the civil war. In order to follow through with this, Abner met with David. When Joab learned of this, he immediately distrusted Abner. He accused him of working under false pretenses to scout out David's military strength and positioning. He sent messengers to retrieve Abner, who David had sent away in peace. This brings us to 2 Samuel 3:27. Now, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber, as if to speak with him privately. And there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. This was a murder, though there were likely not enough witnesses to actually prosecute Joab for it. Numbers 35:30 establishes that no one was to be put to death for murder without the testimony of at least 2 witnesses. For further confirmation that this was a murder, check out David's reaction in 2 Samuel 3:33-34. The king, David, sang this lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before the wicked. And all the people wept over him again. And so, a clear distinction is made between the unfortunate but necessary killing a soldier must engage in on the battlefield and murder off of it. I do want to add that war is a terrible and unfortunate reality of our fallen world. Yet it is often necessary, if for no other reason than for people to defend themselves against those who have chosen to make war on them. Returning to the main topic, the third time a killing is not a murder is when it is accidental. It's a truth that sometimes unfortunate accidents happen. God knows this. For the ancient Israelites, he set aside specific cities to be places that someone who has accidentally killed someone may flee to avoid a relative of the deceased taking revenge. There were a number of rules around this, and the accidental killer had to stay in that city until the death of the high priest. If they left the city, then the one seeking revenge could legally kill them. All of this is laid out in Numbers 35. Here are a few relevant excerpts from that chapter. These 6 towns will be a place of refuge for Israelites and for foreigners residing among them, so that anyone who has killed another accidentally can flee there. But if the accused ever goes outside the limits of the city of refuge, to which they fled, and the Avenger of Blood finds them outside the city, the Avenger of Blood may kill the accused without being guilty of murder. The accused must stay in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Only after the death of the high priest may they return to their own property. There would be a trial involved in this, of course. If it was determined that a murder had been committed rather than an accident, then a city of refuge wouldn't serve as protection. And finally, the fourth time a killing is not a murder is in self-defense. There's not a lot on this in the Bible, but there is Exodus 22, 2-3a, which has some strong restrictions. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Overall, self-defense law in the Old Testament heavily encourages trying to minimally debilitate the other party. Non-lethal injuries resulted in payments of recompense for recovery times. Fatal injuries could result in either a charge of murder if intentional, or if the blow is not intended to kill, then the killer would fall under the same requirements as an accidental death. These two things are covered in Exodus 21 in verses 18-19 and 12-13 respectively. Of course, all of this talk of the Old Testament law primarily serves as a source of insight into God's thinking and how he directed a society to run with the technology of the time. It isn't binding for us today. I do find what it reveals to be enlightening, however. I hope that today's discussion has shed some light on the distinction between killing and murder from God's perspective. If you have any further questions, I welcome them in the comments below. And with that, thank you for listening. Until next time, take care everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's Geekdom of God podcast. To support this program, go to patreon.com/Ciantier. For more, you can visit geekdomofgod.com. Finally, you can email Ciantier at geekdomofgod.com.